So thanks for joining us. First off, I appreciate you getting back to me via email. If you would like to just go ahead and introduce yourself and kind of tell the audience a little bit about you.
Yeah, of course. I'm sure I'm going to get some complaints about this because you watch my videos. People want to complain about everything. But my name is Eric Zelaya. I am the chief investigator and owner of Zelaya and Associates Private Investigators here in Orlando, Florida. If you can't tell, I'm a private investigator. I am a board certified criminal defense investigator as well as a board certified forensic death investigator. I specialize in mainly cases involving criminal defense, people that have been charged with crimes, as well as death investigations for families that are looking just for closure and other answers.
Okay. And so I reached out to you because I saw your video about the Micah Miller case. That was first how I even thought to reach out. So what brought you to this case specifically? I know it's nationwide now, but what got your attention with this case?
So, oddly enough, it was my followers on my pages that actually brought me to that case. I had posted another case, obviously about Gypsy Rose Blanchard, just because she's been in the news recently. And so I posted some expert opinion about some things and my thoughts about that case. And a lot of my followers started commenting about Michael Miller. And I had seen the video of the pastor of her ex husband. I believe his name was John Paul here on
Mhm.
TikTok. But at the time, I wasn't very familiar with that case. Mind you, I've got a lot of cases going
Yeah.
on constantly. And people started tagging me in the videos, and I'm like, all right, let me take a look at this. And it took me maybe a whole 30 seconds, and I was like, this doesn't make much sense.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, and there's so many things about this case that just don't make sense at all, and so many questions people have. And right now, I'm kind of on the fence personally, what I believe happened, just because there's so many unanswered questions. And I feel if those things were answered, everybody could kind of come to a consensus and a realization about what happened. As a private investigator, what do you think is the most shocking thing to you in this case? Because I know it's got like layers, like an onion. It keeps getting deeper and deeper.
I mean, the most shocking thing in any case, and it doesn't matter how big or small, is always the conspiracies. And there's always good ones, and there's some that are great theories, and there's some that are always out there, and one of the things as an investigator that you have to do is you create theories based on the evidence you have in the case. I mean, that's how you solve cases, by looking at the evidence, creating theories, and seeing if the evidence kind of shapes those theories. And so conspiracies, it's a bad word. I hate to use that word. Because really they're just theories, just like we do in any investigation. And so some of the theories that are out there are pretty shocking. But when you actually start looking at the case or peeling it back, some of them aren't too far fetched.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Have you, in your time as private investigator, have you done anything like similar or close to this with a case that had so much attention upon it?
I mean, not really as much attention as this one's getting. I mean, I've been involved in a lot of cases that have been on the news. Um, we've been involved. I say we because I have a business partner. We've been involved with the Casey Anthony case. He actually was the lead investigator on the Casey Anthony case for the defense team. He was involved with some other cases, pretty big cases. So we've dealt with a lot of cases, both from the defense standpoint as well as on behalf of families, um, looking for answers. So we're very, very familiar with, big, high profile cases. We
Mhm.
tend to kind of like go under the radar.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, it's it's along the lines of cases we worked before, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Are you familiar with the Sebastian Rogers case?
Briefly, again, because of TikTok, and mind you, I have, I constantly get people wanting our help on cases, and I wish I could help everybody.
Mhm.
Um, we take so many pro bono cases a year.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, free doesn't pay the bills.
yeah.
I do the best I can, but I am aware of Sebastian Rogers now because of followers, again, making me informed of it. I've started to research it. Um, that one definitely is very intriguing as well, and I've heard some conspiracies about that one, or theories, I should say. And that one's going to be next on my list to talk about at some point.
Well, yeah, I bring that one up just briefly because it's a case that's getting a lot of attention, and then now there's a lot of drama and conspiracy surrounding it.
Yep.
So, what would you think is one of the most important things as a private investigator in handling a case that's high profile, or even is getting attention from the news and media?
The biggest thing, and this is the hardest part for a lot of people, is that it's hard to let emotions be separated from the ability to look for the facts. And family wants answers, and I can understand that. I've lost a brother. My brother passed away a couple of years ago in a motorcycle accident, and I remember my family wanted answers. And it's very, very hard sometimes for family to accept certain things. And so they sometimes have a feeling like they want to help more, and they get sometimes too involved, and that can actually hurt a case.
Mm-hmm.
So, when you have a high profile case like this, it's great to advocate as a family member, but you have to let, if you have a private investigator, to let him do their job.
Yeah.
If you got a good detective, from law enforcement, let them do their job. Sometimes it may look like nothing's happening, but
Mm-hmm.
cops can't always tell you what's going on, or we can't always tell you what's going on because we don't want to jeopardize, a case, a lead, a witness, something like that. So this is the biggest thing that I can say is, for a high profile case, just be patient and let the experts, if you have them, kind of do their job,
Mm-hmm.
and trust what they're doing.
Yeah. Something I'll mention since you mentioned the crossover between private investigators and law enforcement. Something we picked up on throughout watching the Micah Miller case was the fact that the FBI is involved in some capacity now. And so, if you've been watching, it seems that they're just involved in maybe the financial crimes, the potential financial crimes, and the other allegations, but not specifically the death investigation. What do you think of the FBI getting involved just at all and a statement coming out about that?
Usually, you're not going to see the FBI involved in a death investigation unless it's something like a civil rights violation or a hate crime type of incident. Typically, they don't get involved in death investigations. That's outside of the realm of what the FBI,
Mm-hmm.
um, is there for. Granted, they are a law enforcement agency. They have a very wide jurisdiction, but they typically don't do homicide investigations unless it's like civil rights. So with them being involved, and you mentioned that, financial crimes, and there's been talk about fraud, misappropriation of funds between nonprofits, and a bunch of other things like that. A lot of times that's when you'll see the FBI get involved, usually with an IRS task force. Um, so they very well could be investigating simply because of that. And, this suicide investigation, and I say suicide just because that's what the law enforcement has called it. For those that are watching, that's not my personal opinion on this case, just what law enforcement's called it.
Mm-hmm.
But because of the investigation, they're looking into that as well because that may I can't talk today, play a part, mind you, it's 10 o'clock at night my time,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, play a part in, their financial crime investigation if that's what they're doing.
Okay. And so let's talk about the crime scene. What did you think about that? The park, all of the details that we're learning about that, and something that's coming forward now is they're showing the fact that maybe Micah would have had to walk through water to get to where she was. What do you think of that? And the fact
So,
that it was so far out of the way.
it's funny because I had just talked with my business partner Jerry Lyons before I got on this call, and mind you, Jerry is he was the one that worked the Casey Anthony case I mentioned before, the lead
Mhm.
defense investigator. We were just talking about this, and we were going through the timeline. So I kind of want to start with the events leading up to this what we would call a fatal incident. Um, she was on video going into this pawn shop.
Mhm.
If you look at the still shots of this video, this is not a person that appears to be in distress. It's not a person that appears to be, dealing with a psychological emergency. She looked happy on the video at the time of the purchase.
Mhm.
And we're supposed to believe that she was going to commit, self harm.
Yeah.
You know, so you have that first issue leading up to the crime scene. After this, she then goes to fuel up her vehicle and purchase a drink. Now, mind you, she supposedly at this point has already made up her mind to go commit self harm. But now she's fueling up a car that she does not need anymore, you
Mhm.
know, and is purchasing a drink when she obviously doesn't need to drink anything anymore
Mhm.
to go commit self harm,
Yeah.
and So before we get any further than that, forget about the crime scene. Just look at those two things from that perspective. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, well, and did you see the grilled sandwich, the sandwich she had in the passenger seat of her car, sitting right by the weapon case? I mean, that was released by the sheriff's office, and so several of us we were looking at the weapon case, and then we said, "Well, look, there's a sandwich right here, and it
Correct.
looked like a sandwich that she had made." So if you're getting ready, starting your day, making a sandwich, how do you, you know, I mean, how does that even come together and correlate, especially given the fact that the sandwich wasn't eaten?
Exactly. And now, mind you, most of my experience with investigating incidents of self harm, I'm going to call that just for TikTok moderator
Yeah,
self harm.
yeah.
Um, comes from working in the prison. I was a corrections officer. I was on the gang unit. That's where most of my death investigation experience comes from. But self harm is self harm. No matter if you're on the street, in a prison, it's all the same type of investigation. Typically, you're not going to see somebody go through all that length prior to making a commitment to commit self harm. Now, mind you, I have seen people put themselves at ease, like put music on and make the room more comfortable before they did something. That wasn't this case. You don't make yourself a sandwich and go to the gas station to fill up your car and do other self care uh, things that you need to get done,
Yeah.
you know, that you're never going to have to do again if you're going to commit self harm. And so those two things, again, before you even get to the crime scene, those two things don't make any sense whatsoever.
Mhm.
You know, but you look at what we have with the investigation up until this point, and I don't see any indication that the sheriff's office ever went back to look at any of that and see if that made sense.
Mhm.
So, then you go to the crime scene. And let's just talk about, again, you mentioned where her body was found. First off, it was found in the water.
Mhm.
How many people have you heard of? And we have a lot of, there's a lot of self harm, that's on the news. So we know a lot of cases.
Yeah.
How many people have you heard of that will actually walk into the water, before doing something? That's,
Mhm.
first let's look at, statistics. If I can talk, it's a very hard word. You look at the stats, and first and foremost, females are the least likely to commit self harm using a firearm to begin with.
Mhm.
Not saying it doesn't happen, but they're the least likely. But then you're trying to tell me that she also just walked into the woods and then walked through marsh into water. That's just kind of where it doesn't make sense. I mean, you don't have to get farther than that. It already starts breaking down before that point.
Yeah. And so in the cases of self-harm that you've seen, does the location kind of have an effect, in the victim's case? Do they usually choose a location of significance, or does location even have a, because for this it seems like there wasn't a significance of the location. It was just off the whim, and the way it's presented by the sheriff's office, she just looked up national park and went.
Correct, and that seems a little off as well. Now, mind you, sometimes people do have some type of connection to the location in which they're found. We see that with homicide scenes. We see that even with self harm.
Mhm.
Um, Sometimes people do want to go to a secluded location, but the key is typically when you're going to a secluded location, you're doing so because you don't want anybody to find you. You're not going to call up 911 and say, "Hey, look, I'm going out to this location to commit self harm. Please come find me." Typically,
Mhm.
if you're making that much effort to go out in the middle of nowhere, you're doing so because you don't want anybody to find you. And
Yeah.
a lot of the self harm cases that you see around the nation, where people go missing, no contact with the family, they go missing to commit self harm, and they do so because they don't want anybody knowing what they're doing.
Wow.
So the fact that she went through all this effort to then call 911 to, it doesn't add up. Not saying it's not possible, but again, it's not likely, given again stats that we know of.
Yeah. So speaking of that 911 call, what did you make of that? I know there's several speculations going on and rumors about it. And one thing I'll point out with that as well that we've been finding interesting over here is the fact that the kayaker who also called into 911 to report the body, his service was terrible. And several other people I've talked to, it's just kind of word of mouth sources, but they've said that the service out there is spotty. But Micah's service was crystal clear. You didn't miss a word. So what did you think of that? And then just the 911 call in general, the way she was speaking.
So, the 911 call, I've heard the theories about the 911 call, and, I'll get into what I believe,
Yeah.
may have happened, and then we can talk about the theories.
Yeah.
First off, in regards to cell phone, I mean, so without getting too technical, because what I like to do is try to break things down for people
Mhm.
that don't understand like you and I may understand,
And
or
that's
people that don't
helpful.
have my background training. So cell phones, it's a radio. This is a little radio device that receives signals. We all know that.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have cell phone towers that send out the signals. Those cell phone towers have three antennas on them. Usually, some carriers have six, but besides the point, they direct the radio signals in that direction, and it comes to our little cell phone. So depending on her carrier, the weather, location, I mean, there's so many variables that can determine whether somebody's cell phone is great or not great. So it's hard to give an opinion on that because that is so variable. I mean, you could be in one spot and have perfect signal and move 2 inches and have terrible signal. It really is that crazy. Um, and I've seen people mentioning in the comments that the surrounding area has no service, but they have signal at the beach area. So, and like I said, I mean, you can go to one spot and it varies carrier to carrier. So sometimes
Yeah. So it
but
could have just
what
been
I,
where she was in the right spot at the right time.
it very well could have been, or she could have called, prior to even getting to the location, maybe in an area where she had good signal still.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there's a lot of questions that we don't have because remember we don't know everything that she did up until that point, everything that happened up until that point.
Mm-hmm. And
So yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Okay. Well, and that's what I was going to get into, about a lot of the things we don't know. What did you think of the investigation aspect of it and, how much the police decided to pursue the investigation to the point of not very far and they just kind of made their decision without even doing an autopsy?
Well, and that's the thing is every state has different autopsy laws, and so while we're here, let's look up. This is North Carolina, right?
Yeah,
I was getting
that's
it was
North
north or south.
Carolina. Yeah, North Carolina.
So let's look up what the autopsy laws are there, because here in Florida, any case, including a suicide, any case with self harm, homicide, any death that occurs outside of a hospital or outside of a doctor's presence gets investigated by the medical examiner's office because that's considered a suspicious death. So it doesn't
Mhm.
matter if it's self harm or if it's an unintended death, it gets investigated. So let's see. In North Carolina, according to the law, it says that all deaths of unnatural causes are supposed to have a legal investigation, including an autopsy, as a portion of the evidence gathering process.
Hmm.
So that is what the law supposedly says. Now, whether or not they want to follow the law, again, they could have called the medical examiner's office out there, and the ME's office said, you know what, we're not going to touch this. We don't feel a need to.
Yeah.
We don't know what actually happened. And unfortunately, some medical examiner's offices in some states and even some counties are just lazy like that. And they'll say, you know what, we know what happened. We're not going to do anything else. End of story. I can tell you that based on how quickly this was wrapped up, there was no thorough investigation.
Hmm.
Every case of unintended death should be treated as a homicide until you can prove otherwise. And the way that we were always taught to do investigations, and the way that I even still do investigations, whether you're charged with a crime and I'm helping you, or you're, a family of a cold case,
Yeah.
that is to, uh, you know, you've got the victim, and you draw a circle around the victim, and you investigate everything in that circle around the victim. Family,
Mhm.
friends, everything. The cops didn't do that in this case.
Yeah, and there's something else relating to the crime scene and things that should have been investigated. The father and the family of Micah Miller, they started speaking out recently, and they're the ones who brought it to the public's attention that her father states that she appears to have defensive wounds on her hands. So scratches and bruising along her hands and her arms. And we haven't seen these publicly, but the father says he has photos. So especially if there was markings like that, you think that would be investigated, or at least the authorities would kind of give the family some type of answer as to why there's these markings on their loved one.
Correct. And a big question would be whether those are perimortem wounds or postmortem wounds. And again,
Mm.
let's break those down. Postmortem
Yeah,
is
break
after
those
death.
down because
Perimortem is
that's
before death.
last night we were discussing this, and there was a lot of
Correct.
conversation. Maybe they happened after death. Maybe they happened, sometime. And so we don't know, and the family may not know either exactly, but they know what they think they see, and that's something that kind of needs to be addressed and answered, hopefully by the authorities. But go ahead and speak on that and what the difference could be.
Yeah, so obviously, if she had post-mortem injuries, one of the things that you're going to think of is, okay, well, maybe it could have been animal. A lot of times after somebody passes away, before they're found, and there was a couple hours before she was found, you're going to have animal activity, animal scratches, and so that's why it's important to determine during an autopsy whether or not those injuries were sustained before or after the passing, and you can do that by looking at the injury, seeing if the blood had coagulated, all the stuff that you're taught when you go to become a forensic pathologist. Um, so that's a lot, and I'll discuss my own call again too. I think we skipped over some part of that, um, but you know, if you didn't do the autopsy and you didn't investigate that thoroughly, then it's entirely possible that these could have very well been defensive wounds. And this goes back to the 911 call. There's a lot of talk about whether it could be AI, this, that, and the other. In
Yeah.
cases like this that I have worked or I have given an opinion on, because I've done other videos for other people with opinions just like this. In other cases like this, a lot of times, you'll have a murder for hire situation. So, in this case, John Paul was out of town. That doesn't
Mhm.
mean that he may not have been involved. And again, I'm not going to sit here and say whether or not he was involved. I haven't investigated enough to be able to give an opinion.
Yeah.
But what I can tell you is that, you can still have a murder for hire where, he could be somewhere else and have hired somebody to intercept her, hold her and force that 911 call and essentially stage this scene to look like a self-harm incident when really it was a homicide or a murder for hire. And so one of my theories is that this 911 call was a forced 911 call, not necessarily a generated 911 call, just because that would be very very difficult to do, and again would have involved another person
Hmm.
having to be present there.
Yeah.
And again, we'll go back to the theory of this being a kidnapping or a
Mhm.
murder for hire.
So you think it's more likely that the phone call was forced by Micah than an AI type situation?
In other cases similar to this one that either I have been involved in, given an opinion on, or I have been, associated with or know about, it's usually a murder for hire situation, and it's more likely that this is probably a situation where somebody forced her to make that 911 call to fabricate the evidence this was a self harm incident.
Yeah. And something else I want to clear up, there was a lot of conversation about the surveillance footage from the pawn shop because in that footage you see Micah wearing a necklace, and then in some frames it doesn't seem like she's wearing the necklace, and then she has a tattoo on her hand. And for most of that footage we never saw the tattoo, but we finally got a still where we were able to see the tattoo. So is it common in different surveillance cameras for simple lines or necklaces to appear and then not appear, or something like that?
Sometimes yes or no. So a lot of times we think of cameras as like what you and I are doing right now, where it's constantly recording. But not all cameras actually do that. Some cameras actually record, like the old school cameras, where it just takes a series of pictures
Mhm.
every couple of seconds, and so you don't have when it puts it together as a video, it kind of meshes it into these separate little frames, so it's like very very choppy. So you won't see fluid movements. And so, depending on how somebody is moving or positioning themselves, it is sort of possible to maybe have a situation where, an item changes location or is just entirely missing because of how the picture was taken that very second.
Mhm.
Um, but I would have to look at it more thoroughly. There are ways to kind of examine the video using forensic experts to be able to give an opinion on that. But yes, there is some older camera technology that could cause that issue. But again, those are theories that would need to be looked into that
Yeah.
are both very viable theories.
So, given everything that entails this case, you have the financial aspect, the pastor aspect, and then the wife aspect, and the fact that they were going through a divorce and there was already a previous wife and all these allegations coming out. If you were to get on this case, what would be the first thing you would do and try to like investigate? I know there's a lot, but what do you think you would start? Where would be the starting point in that?
Well, remember, and I said this before, you treat every case with a unattended death as a homicide. So this is a homicide investigation. So you start from round one. You go back through everybody's history. So from the first time that this relationship started between John Paul and uh, Mica, and we have rumor that this supposedly started when she was 10 years old. So you start looking into everything from that point up until this point, and you get a thorough history on everybody involved with this case and everybody involved with her life, with his life, complete picture, and then you start looking into everything else that's happened up until that point. Because if you start going in there and just trying to investigate the death and what exactly happened with that and nothing else, you're not going to get any answers because you need to be able to fill in the rest of the blanks with everything else that's happened before that because it all paints one giant picture. It's all important.
And that's something that I found interesting about this case. You know, the death specifically. I mean, it's painted to look in a certain light as it was self inflicted, and if you're just looking at the death, I could see that. But once you account for everything else that's surrounding the death, all the multiple circumstances within Micah's life, it's hard for me to see it as that anymore. It's kind of changing the picture and changing my perception of it. Something else I want to ask relating to the death and the crime scene. So, Micah, her husband, it was claimed that she's bipolar, and I believe there is medical documentation that backs that up. So, in instances where there is a history of mental illness or documented mental illness, how common is it or uncommon for the examiner or the investigators to try to do a toxicology and see if they were on their medication at the time they passed?
It's relatively common to do a toxicology screen. For any unattended death investigation, you usually have a toxicology screen. They don't specifically test for those medications, but they do test for a series of medications and sometimes benzodiazepines and other medications used to treat bipolar disorder will sometimes fall in those drug screens. But usually, as a medical examiner or even as a medical examiner investigator, part of your job is to investigate the decedent's medical history. So, if they did a proper autopsy, they should have known her medical history and her medications and all that stuff from their medical history investigation. And if that wasn't done, they wouldn't have known any. They would not have known anything.
Yeah. That was one thing that I found interesting because a lot of the testing that took place, it appeared that there wasn't any testing that took place. A lot of the family they asked questions. They said, "Did you do this? Did you do this?" And it appeared that that wasn't done. What did you think of the allegations that came out? It appears to be confirmed now by John Paul that there were trackers placed on the car and a device that deflates the tires. Have you ever had any experience with that type of device that deflates tires?
I've not had any experience with somebody having a device that deflates tires, but I've had plenty of experience with, estranged spouses and, domestic violence partners. And this is what it boils down to is abuse. And, we talk about this a lot, these days, but, you know, spousal abuse, partner abuse. Obviously this guy was very controlling. This is controlling behavior. I've had situations, cases I've worked, back in my early days of this job where I did surveillance, working these types of cases where, spouses would destroy each other's cars and stuff like that. So this is not uncommon for a spouse with serious problems in their own personal life to start doing this type of thing. And the GPS tracker, for her getting, she's the one that initiated a restraining order, against, individuals that supposedly were being hired by him. She's the one that, was getting the divorce. He placed a GPS tracker on her vehicle. I mean, that's just controlling behavior.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. Do you have any theories about what you think happened, or any theories that you'd want to share with the audience?
I think you guys can probably figure out my theory at this point, but my most likely theory, if I had to give a theory just based on the evidence right now, and to mind you, I've reached out to the family to offer my assistance. I believe they have a PI working with somebody. I'm not really sure about that. We've offered my team support, but we haven't heard back from anybody. But my theory has been that most likely, again, I've seen this happen before, that he probably, and I say he, John Paul, may have hired somebody to take care of his wife. Obviously he had some type of clout, for lack of a better word, prior to all of this, and this was probably very damaging to all of that. I think that he hired somebody to take care of her, and that's what happened. And I think they staged it as a suicide. And one of the things that I had offered to the family, and again, when we talk about pro bono, this is one of those things is crime scene reconstruction. It's something that we do, crime scene reconstruction, because one of the things our we can do is you can recreate the scene in 3D animation, and you can determine whether anything that scene shows is actually physically possible. Using math and science.
Mhm.
And I don't think the police did that. And with the technology that we have, we can actually go out there, take photographs, put it into a 3D model, and show you whether or not she could have, you know, killed herself, shot herself on the shore, ended up in the water, a bunch of crazy stuff, things the police did not do. Um, but unfortunately, because the cops dropped the ball, they didn't do an investigation. They just kind of went out there quick and closed out as self harm. The family's fighting for answers. So
Yeah, and what did you think of the fact that she was cremated so soon after her passing? And is there any testing that can be done on cremated remains, or have you had any cases or any knowledge of investigations in cremated remains?
so yes, you can actually go back and test cremated remains for toxicology. However, it's very limited in what you can test for. Some chemical compounds do not remain, after the high heat of cremation. They don't remain in any of the teeth or the bones. So there are some chemical compounds that could be tested for. It's not 100% guarantee, but there is a possibility. It's just expensive. But yes, it can be done. It can be done. And I forgot your other question.
Just what did you think of the rush to cremation in this case?
I have seen that before, and a lot of times a rush to cremation by somebody who is a person of interest is usually a means to hide evidence.
Mhm.
A lot of people believe that cremating hides DNA evidence, it hides toxicology evidence, but really it does not. It does not. But usually that's why people push for cremation is because they think it hides evidence as the quickest way to do it.
Now, something else that we've learned in this case and we've discussed up to this point is it seems that the phone, Micah Miller's phone that she had at the time she passed, is in evidence and it's being held by the investigators. So, do you think that means that they're still looking into the phone? The family's supposed to get the phone, and they say that they want it because there's a lot of evidence on there that Micah was gathering in preparation for her divorce, and so they're looking forward to getting it back. But it's still being held by law enforcement at this time. So do you think that means that there's still some type of investigation, or what do you think's going on there?
With the fact that they supposedly closed this investigation out as a
Mhm.
suicide, and the fact that they still have evidence being held, leads me to believe that there probably is something else going on. Now, they could be holding it because it's part of the estate. However, that's not a law enforcement function. That has nothing to do with law enforcement. The phone should be turned back over to the family because it becomes the property of the family, the next of kin. So the
Mhm.
fact that they still have the phone leads me to believe that maybe they're looking into something else. So again, it goes back to the fraud thing. Potentially her phone is evidence of fraud involving John Paul. We don't know. So that is a good theory that possibly the phone is evidence of another crime involving somebody else.
Mhm. Okay, well, I do want to thank you for coming on. You could take a few questions from the chat if you'd like, but I do want to thank you for hopping on and sharing all that with us. We've been discussing
Yeah, I
this case
appreciate it.
for the past few weeks, and so having a professional to come on and speak is something that I think we could all appreciate. If anybody has any questions in the chat, feel free to ask, and he might be able to answer a few before he hops off.
Somebody asked the next of kin would be her husband. It's more of a legal thing, but typically when you're getting a divorce and there's restraining order stuff like that, usually it's not going to be next of kin at that point. Most courts are not going to grant anything. If you're contesting, the relationship. So I don't think that would have been him. But again, I'm not an attorney, but that's typically how that works.
Okay. So,
I don't know who has remains or ashes. The crime scene photos would help. I mean, if somebody accessed the crime scene photos, I mean that would definitely be of great assistance for an investigation. And actually, a lot of opinion could be gathered from those crime scene photos that could be done in the video as well.
okay.
How hard would it be? How hard would it be to prove homicide? I mean, at this point, nearly impossible because again, law enforcement close out their investigation. Typically they're not going to reopen it. So once they close out a death investigation, that's pretty much it. And that's why some of your families struggle because they have no way of getting back into getting any justice because the case has already been closed.
Mhm. Something I'm seeing a lot in the comments. It's been said that the weapon used in this case ended up 130 feet away from the body. Have you ever seen anything like that in a self-harming case?
No, I've not
Okay.
seen a weapon end up that far away from somebody in a self-harming incident unless they failed and they were able to walk away and they had injuries that were mortal later on.
Hmm.
But usually a GSW, to the head would
Yeah.
be usually fatal very immediately. And again, a firearm is not going to float in the water; it's going to sink in the water.
Hmm.
So so unless there was a fast current, maybe that's possible. But typically, no. And again, that's why I mentioned that doing a crime scene reconstruction could be very useful because you might be able to see something or come up with a theory that nobody thought of before.
Hmm.
No, a PI cannot get a case back open usually when it's closed. I mean, a lot of times we try to bring cases back. For a cold case where it's an unsolved homicide, yes, but usually in a case where it's already been ruled and signed off as a self harm incident, and law enforcement closed the case. Typically, they're not going to reopen it. Doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but it's very very rare for it to happen. I think somebody's asking again if the case is closed while they still have her phone. I think I mentioned before, if there's a financial crime going on, that might be why the FBI is involved or investigating something involving the church or JP or fraud. They may be keeping the phone as evidence for that case. They may have found evidence in the phone that may, be evidence to implicate somebody else in an unrelated investigation.
Yeah.
How do I feel about the boat? I'm assuming you're talking about the kayaker that found the body.
Mhm.
Um, again, like I said before, everybody involved in the case should be a person of interest until you rule them out. And if you don't do a thorough investigation, then you really haven't ruled anybody out. So, obviously, in my opinion, the kayak is a person of interest until I could figure out otherwise.
Yeah. As well as I'm sure you've heard about the fisherman. There is a fisherman who apparently saw her
Heard, I
belongings.
think,
Yeah,
yeah,
and went through the belongings, and that's how it was reported that she had over $500 cash on her, which is a large amount of money to carry with you to perform this type of act. And that's something we've discussed on our page. The fisherman was somebody who just seemed a little off in the fact that he went through her belongings and touched the belongings, especially given now that it turned into a crime scene.
yeah, correct. And I see a couple comments too about saying, well, there's not going to be any justice. The case can't be reopened. Well, it's not exactly true. I mean, a lot of times what the family wants is closure, but you know, there's always going to be justice, even if the case doesn't get reopened and somebody gets arrested. You're still advocating for change, and that's the biggest thing is that by doing all this work and bringing attention to this case and by putting this stuff out there, putting these abusers out there, putting these flaws of the sheriff's department out there, you're advocating for change, and that makes a huge impact for these cases in the long run. And I've personally seen detectives turn over a new leaf after advocacy and start doing a better job because of people just like you guys going out there and advocating. So even if a case can't be reopened or even somebody doesn't get arrested, not all is lost. There's still a lot of good that can come out of everything that's being done. And even me taking it upon myself to go back and looking into this case or request records, and start posting about it. It brings attention to the case. It could bring change to laws. There's a lot that can be done. Even if somebody doesn't get arrested or even doesn't get reopened. So,
Mhm.
I would say to those that are making those comments, don't ever think that all is lost, that hope is lost because you can't, there's not an arrest or anything like that. There's still a lot that can be done, and one small thing you do can make a huge impact.